by doing nothing, you're making a choice, right? And that choice is to kick the can down the road. So can you tackle the problem now, or are you going to leave it to the people behind you to tackle later because you don't want to deal with it?
This is the Livable Future Podcast. My name is Cody Sanford. I would like to start today's episode with a land acknowledgement. We are creating this podcast on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne nations. We acknowledge these people and their contributions to this region. This episode is focused on how we as a society may have misinterpreted fire's role in ecosystems across the United States. To start, we need a brief overview of the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service was created in 1905 with the goals of protecting the timber supply chain and ensuring quality water in the United States. The Forest Service has viewed fire suppression as essential to this goal. In 1910, a huge fire known as the Big Blow Up burned 3 million acres in a matter of days. After this, the agency gained public and government support for more staffing, resources, and an overall change in the way we manage forests. This was the beginning of complete fire suppression in the United States, and it remained the policy until modern ecology began to understand the importance of wildfire's role in ecosystems. This led to the Let It Burn policy, which grew in popularity in land management practices in the 1970s and 80s until the Yellowstone fire in '88, which burned approximately 500,000 acres. This is obviously a quick overview of U.S. fire policy. If you would like to know more, I'll have these resources on the Livable Future Podcast website, but some important resources for this section have been the Forest History Society and the U.S. Forest Service. I would recommend checking their websites for an in-depth history lesson. So, present day, the Forest Service estimates that 73,000 wildfires burn an average of 7 million acres a year. Fire in our ecosystems is nothing new, but not all fires are the same. Some forests are dense, dry, and filled with acres of dead timber, and this will lead to more intense wildfires. My favorite local forests are the Arapaho and Roosevelt. These forests encompass the foothills, valleys, and mountains around Rocky Mountain National Park and cover over 1.7 million acres in size. Hiking through these forests is intrinsically beautiful, but it's also easy to spot the signs of distress. Clumps of dead forest from invasive pine beetles stick out like a sore thumb. These environmental conditions led way to the largest fire in Colorado history. In 2020, the Cameron Peak Fire burned 208,663 acres, mostly in these forests. The vast majority of wildfires are not ever to this magnitude, but it's the wildfires like this that we hear about because they are causing destruction to communities and people. But there's actually a lot of ecological and societal benefits to wildfires that I believe help give a more holistic perspective on wildfires in general. I mentioned that wildfires are viewed as natural in the ecosystems, and that's because these places change. It's called ecological succession. Fire is a main cause of this succession in a landscape. A major disturbance has the potential for many benefits to the environment and to the people who live there. After a fire, sun-loving plants have a chance to grow, which provides habitat for diverse species of pollinators that have co-evolved to this environment. Fires are a tool for creating open spaces. The open spaces provide humans the opportunity for pastures, to grow agriculture, and for hunting. And this is something that's been ongoing for thousands of years. Here, I want to mention I'm summarizing a peer-reviewed journal titled Wildfires as Ecosystem Services, published in ESA journals, written by Julie Pazos and John Keeley. What I find most fascinating is the regulating services that wildfires provide. The most obvious one is the reduction in extreme wildfires. The more small wildfires means the less chance of a big fire. Wildfires also provide pest control and even help with water regulation. The fewer trees consuming water means this resource is now available elsewhere in the ecosystem. What I find super fascinating is that researchers found that this was one of the reasons Native Americans traditionally used fire as a tool. The best news for Colorado following these fires, I find, is that research shows that ecosystems with forest clearings have the potential for deeper snowpack that melts later in spring compared to dense forests. Now I think it's time to bring in a fire management analyst, Dr. Casey Teske from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, who's here to help explain fire's role in the ecosystem. Dr. Teske, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Could you go into more detail as to what your role is?
So I basically I call it fire forecasting. We have weathermen that tell us what the weather's going to do. My people like me, our role is to try to understand what the fire is going to do in the long term. So in the next week to month, and that's based on historical data. That's based on what the current vegetation and topography is, where the fire is located. It's based on forecasts. So what's the fire going to do in the next 2 to 5 days? And so all this information is compiled. And what we do is we can come up with maps, basically, for the operational people. So the people who are actually putting out fires, whether it's with digging the hand line like the hot shots do, or putting it out with the engines with the water, or the aircraft dropping the turbines on it, or whatever. So we try to see where the fire is likely to go and how it's going to behave when it gets there, and then we think it's going to get there based on all these conditions. And then we can use that information to be tactical and strategic about what we're going to do. Our biggest concerns are to keep people safe. We can replace a tree, but we can't replace a life. And so we want to keep the public and the firefighters safe. And so if we know a fire is going to be very aggressive in the way that it's traveling to a location, we might not put people in front of that, but we might know that it will be there in 3 days. So maybe the next 2 days we can try to make better lines or prepare the houses or the infrastructure so that they don't burn, stuff like that. So we use the information that people like me give to make operational and tactical decisions. So that's what that role is. And then we really look into the long term to try to understand where we're sitting with regard to this season. So is this fire in June? And is this normal for June? Is this kind of stuff normal for August? And then, try to compare to other known things that people might remember. So people remember a fire from 2012 that was also in a general area, I think it's called Hyde Park. And so people were very curious, is this going to act like Hyde Park? Where the place where Hyde Park burned, will that be enough to stop Canada Heat from progressing? So we look at all those kinds of things and then try to give the best information we can using the science available to us and the models available to us. And they're getting better all the time. So maybe it wasn't perfect 10 years ago. It's never going to be perfect, but we're always improving. So we think that these tools can help people make better decisions.
Yeah, it seems like a really cool profession. Dr. Teske, I want to ask, how do you view our society's current relationship with the forests?
We love the forests, and we love it because it's beautiful. There's trees, there's grass, there's shrubs, and it's all, different kinds of forests have different characteristics. And what we're seeing is that some forests have not had natural processes in them, or man-made processes that might be chemical processes. So you might have put out fires, and so vegetation grows thicker than it may have normally grown prior to fire suppression. We can go in and treat those areas at times, but if we don't do that, then some of these thick conditions basically cause the forest potentially to become unhealthy. And unhealthy forests, their immunity to things like stressors like bugs or fire or root rot or different natural phenomena is lessening. So things that I am seeing in different parts of the country are maybe bug kill. You have a lot of bug kill in the Rocky Mountains in North Korea. In the Great Basin, which is Nevada, Southern Idaho, Utah, we have a lot of invasive species. So fires came through and have taken out the native species, and they've been replaced by things like cheatgrass, which changes how the fire cycle works in these ecosystems. So there's a lot of different conditions that make a forest or a grassland or a shrubland not what it used to be and not healthy that would be considered red flags. And then you couple that with things like climate change or urban growth out into forests and in places that need fire. So you have compounding conditions that make things tricky.
Yeah, one of those conditions you mentioned was cheatgrass, and that's something that I'm seeing everywhere. I want to ask, is there anything that you know that we can do? I know I just try to brush it off my clothes, make sure I don't carry it with me, but what do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I know there's research into biological controls for it, so fungus or amoebas or whatever that can maybe control that, but they don't really know. It outcompetes the natives. The cycle of cheatgrass is on a different timeline than that of grasses, and so it's sprouting earlier and it's coming up earlier and it's taking advantage of this bare ground in a way that the native grasses and plants are not. So it's a tough one to outcompete for sure. The best you can do is, like you said, if you're out there, just make sure that you're washing your rigs and taking those, getting those seeds out of there. So when you go from place to place, you're not carrying them around, checking your clothes. But yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah, the cheatgrass, it's moving so quickly through our ecosystems. Dr. Teske, I know you did modeling for the Cameron Peak fire. Would you go into more detail as to what conditions led up to this and what modeling was like for this fire?
Sure. So the Cameron Peak fire was burning in subalpine forests, and those forests are pretty thick, and right now they have a lot of beetle kill in them. And they're also in very rugged terrain. So when we think about fires, we think about the fuels or the vegetation, and about the weather, and we think about the topography. And so if you have flat terrain versus steep and rugged terrain, you're going to get very different fire behavior. If you have healthy forests versus forests that are really stressed because of things like insects and disease, which we have on Cameron Peak, or fuels buildup, or different things like that, you're going to have different fire behaviors. And when we have extreme fall weather events like we were starting to see, with those late August into September, October fires, those are prime conditions to reach extreme and critical fire behaviors.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Overall, I do know our audio is breaking up a little bit there, but I think that section is important to keep in this episode. I do want to shift gears. Dr. Teske, I've heard you mention the term fuel treatment a few times. Can you go into more detail as to what that is?
My layman's terms of fuels treatments are you basically give the vegetation a haircut, right? So the vegetation is always growing, and the more vegetation, and vegetation is synonymous with fuels if it's available to burn. So dry grass, dry brush, dry needles. The more vegetation there is, the more that is potentially available to burn. So if you can treat those fuels by removing them or thinning them or changing from cheatgrass back to natives or whatever it is, then you can impact those fires and how they behave. So by removing fuels, you're giving a fuels treatment, you're doing a haircut, you're batching, you're reducing what's available to burn, and that's what a fuels treatment is.
Yeah, and I want to ask, what are your thoughts on the people who are against these fuel treatments, whether they think it's too expensive or they're against prescribed fires? Do you have any words on the matter?
You know, by doing nothing, you're making a choice, right? And that choice is to kick the can down the road. So can you tackle the problem now, or are you going to leave it to the people behind you to tackle later because you don't want to deal with it? So treating the vegetation with fire or thinning or grazing, whatever your needs is in an appropriate way, I think it's important, especially if you could do it in terms of weather that are not crazy, right? Those kinds of treatment activities on our terms instead of on nature's terms could potentially, you could be strategic about it.
Dr. Teske, I'm going to read a quote I hear environmentalists say, then I'd like your opinion. 2020 was one of the most severe years for wildfires in the last 50 years. In the next 50 years, 2020 will be at the low end of years with severe wildfires. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that quote is true. I've seen it in my career. We're changing. The weather's changing. Our fire season starts earlier. It stays longer. It used to just be a summer job, and now it's hard to get on if you're a student because you need to go back to school and they need you for a long period of time. In 2000, that was a big wildfire season in North Idaho and Montana, and people had never seen anything like it. And I'm hearing, I've never seen anything like this pretty much every single fire I'm on these days. And so I feel like that quote is correct, that this is going to be, it's just going to keep getting, we're going to keep having big fire seasons, big wildfires, lots of active fires at the same time. Our weather's changed, our seasons have changed, and our fuels have changed. And so, that's a big, melting pot of conditions to make things potentially worse. We're definitely not every year is going to be a big fire year. We'll have wet years. We'll have drought years where nothing can grow. So even if we do have lightning, maybe there's nothing to start the fire. So, all these conditions and how they interplay with each other really can dictate that. I do think that what we're seeing now is here. We're going to see more of this in the future, and this could be the start of it. It could be a blip. It could be, the low end of it. I can't predict that far out, but it's definitely not out of normal anymore.
Yeah. And so, Dr. Teske, I want to ask, is there any policy decision or resource or anything else that you as a fire ecologist need to help this situation?
I think science and policy and management are intertwined in this infinite loop, and which one comes first and which one informs the other is definitely, they're continuously changing, right? So you find out something new with the science and you try to implement that on the management side, and maybe it becomes a policy as well. And so I think funding the science is important so that we understand what's happening. I think that our natural resources, the benefit to the public is huge, but I think that we're not seen in the same way as some other important things out there. And so trying to make sure that natural resources are a part of the public's experience. So how do we do that? Well, we find science, we do science, we promote those messages, we integrate that into policy and management, and it's just a continuous cycle. So the resources we need are data sets, computing solutions, really creative solutions. What are some challenges that we are starting to see that we haven't had to think about before? We need some creative minds looking at those things. So those are some ways that we can help think about those things, and then to implement it is the next. So how do you establish what you've found in the science work, or how do you establish what the policy is mandating? That's the trick for the managers. And I think if you can get scientists and managers talking together and working together and understanding each other's needs, I think that could really help, because there's a lot of land managers that are really familiar with the land, but they may or may not be as comfortable with the scientific side of things. But if you have a scientist that might not be comfortable with the land management side of things, if you can pair those groups up and help them to understand each other's problems, I think you have a pretty powerful combination. So more collaboration, more communication. I'll always advocate for science.
Me too. Dr. Teske, thank you for being a guest on this episode of the Livable Future podcast. And I would like to thank you, the listener, for staying tuned. I know the audio wasn't perfect this episode. Overall, if you have any questions, comments, or would like more information from us, you can find us on social media or at the Livable Future podcast website. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and have a great rest of your day. Thanks now.